you with us as well. We do want to take this moment to invite our online guests to participate in our gathering tonight. Later on, we will have a business session, and we invite you to cast your votes during that business session on those online platforms. Ask your questions. Towards the end of the night, we'll have a panel discussion, and we welcome you to ask your questions in the comments, both on the Facebook page and our YouTube channel, whichever one that you're on. So feel free to actively participate in this gathering because we need you and we want you to do just that. And if you're in-house tonight, we welcome you as well. The nearest bathrooms, should you need one, are just out my right down the hallway in the west lobby. You can find the restroom there. Our theme tonight is, what does the Lord require of us? That has been said before. That question has been posed before by someone I trust. The prophet Micah once asked, what does the Lord require of us? Extravagant worship, sacrificed bulls, firstborn children. What does the Lord require of us? But to act justly and love mercy and walk humbly. And so we gather tonight to call ourselves to that, to celebrate the work that we've already done, which is worthy of celebration, and to summon ourselves to do that work in a more faithful and effective way moving forward. So thanks for being here tonight. I'm excited to hear Dr. Hauser and the ways that she is fulfilling the prophet Micah's vision of what God's will is all about. I'm excited to share with you news later about the merger of CBF Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, and to do the business in the room that needs to be conducted. So welcome, make yourselves at home. Let's pray, and I'll turn it over to Randy Hyde, our interim coordinator. Teach us, O Lord, what it means to act justly in a world of so much injustice. Teach us to spot inequities even when we don't feel them personally. Teach us to strive for righteousness in our own lives and in our own families and in our own systems. Teach us what it means to love mercy, to be sensitive to those around us who are in pain and agony or on the fringes. And teach us what it means to walk humbly, to be learners, to be people of open minds and open hearts, not closed minds and hard hearts. For we really do desire to do your will. We celebrate all the forebears of CBF Arkansas who go before us even tonight. And we're mindful of the children who might carry on this work in the region for decades to come. And we ask that our work, O Lord, have something to do with your work. To the extent that it does, make us bold and firm and resolute. To the extent that it doesn't, change us and make us new. And give us the wisdom to know the difference. In the name of the Father and Son and Holy Spirit, we pray, one God now and forever. Amen.
Thank you, Preston, and thank you, Second Baptist Church, for hosting us tonight. May I share a pet peeve with you? One of my pet peeves is to attend a funeral and the officiant reads the obituary. The obituary has been in the newspaper, And more often than not, the obituary is printed in the bulletin that is provided for the people who attend the service. And yet, the preacher reads it. Myra Hauser's biography is printed in tonight's program. So I'm not going to read it. Of course, that kind of leaves out some of the folks that are live streaming with us tonight, and for that I apologize, except to say that I cannot believe it has been 8 years since she and her husband Jason came back to Arkansas. Shortly after they returned, I contacted them, and we met at Milo's Coffee in Hillcrest, just down the street from the church I was pastoring at the time. Of course, I knew Jason's parents, Greg and Sue Smith, who are field personnel for CBF in Virginia, working largely with Hispanic groups. And this gave me an opportunity to meet their son and his bride. And when I got home, I told my bride, they are a winsome, wonderful young couple. I wish they lived in Little Rock. We were looking for a church staff position at the time, and I thought Jason would have been just absolutely perfect for it. But there is this thing called I-30 between Little Rock and Arkadelphia, and that created a little bit of an issue, and I understand that. She has been in the history department all this time at Ouachita and has made her mark. A lot of things have happened in these last 8 years, and maybe she'll have an opportunity to tell us about that, but I don't want to take any more of her time except to welcome Myra Hauser to be with us tonight to talk with us about her plans on campus for a social justice program, and exactly in keeping with what we have been told the prophet has told us. So Myra, welcome to CBF Arkansas. We're glad to have you here.
Well, thank you, Randy and Preston, and thank you all so much for being here and here. I don't know where to look at the camera tonight. But I thought that was a great biography. I'll tell y'all a couple more things about myself. One, Randy actually already told you I'm an historian, so I can't leave well enough alone talking about what's happening. So you guys are going to get a lot of long historical context. Not long. You're going to get a little bit of historical context here tonight. Another thing that I'm realizing in this moment that I did not tell Suzanne when I was telling her about AV stuff is that I'm typically a mover when I talk. So I'm not used to standing like this, so you're going to get all the weird hand gestures and all of that since I did not ask for the capabilities to wander around. And then the third thing that y'all should know is that I really like audience participation when I talk, so I usually don't leave my classes alone either. They have to say things, and that means a couple of things for y'all. It means that I'm going to try to not take this whole hour because I want us to be able to have some conversation, and I know that y'all may have comments or discussion as well. But it also means that I'm going to open by asking y'all a question, and I'm actually going to expect you to answer. What is justice? And I'm good with awkward silences, I'll tell you that too. The golden rule. Love with legs, I like that. Fairness and equity. I'll take one more and then I'll leave y'all alone. Very good. So it shouldn't be harder for anybody. So going with fairness and equity, love with legs. Yeah, very good. So the thing about justice is this. It's something we talk about a lot. It's also a very, very, very amorphous thing. And so I work a lot with really students of all levels, but a lot of freshmen, and I teach a course on justice. And on the first day of class, I ask this question, and everybody knows what justice is. And on the last week of classes, when we're writing papers about it, nobody's quite sure what it is anymore. It's really weird. So it is something that we know is a really ancient concept. We see it in the Bible. And I didn't actually expect Micah 6:8 to be here when I was going to mention it. So it's something that we see in Micah 6:8. We quote that all the time: do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. We see it in the New Testament as well. Pure justice is this: to love and care for orphans and widows and people in their time of distress. Let justice roll down like waters. Which we actually probably associate more with Dr. King than with the Bible, but it's from Isaiah also, as he well knew. It's a concept that comes up then in Judaism and Christianity and Eastern religions. It's something that comes up philosophically. So Plato and Aristotle talked about justice, and they talked about friendship. And they talked about justice as being something that was a balancing of interests as well. So that gets with equality and fairness and how we think about it today, but a balancing of interests. Later on, people would talk about it as part of how we think about our relationship with government, right? So philosophers during the Enlightenment talk about justice as part of a contract that we have with our government, where we do what we're supposed to, the government does what they're supposed to, everybody gets what they want to out of it. But no matter how much we talk about it, it remains a pretty elusive concept, and a concept that's pretty tough to define, and that actually causes some problems a lot of times, because I define it the way I want to, Preston defines it the way he wants to, Randy defines it the way he wants to, and then we're all talking about a different thing. So I'm not here today to give us an answer about what justice is or isn't, because I have my answer, but I still don't have a great answer for us outside of something that just gives us a little space to kind of work with. But I do want to talk a little bit about just lessons in justice and kind of how that works and some of the things that I've learned working in the program that I work in. So to give you a little bit of background, Randy gave you some background already. I grew up overseas. I grew up in Southern Africa. And so my early memories were thinking about injustices and hearing this word a lot. I grew up primarily in Botswana, which was majority led, and when I was 9, we moved to Namibia, my family did. And Namibia had been occupied by apartheid South Africa, so we heard a lot about how justice had finally come, and there were different terms that people used: fairness, equity, all of that as well. But for a 9-year-old, that was something that was pretty new kind of in my conscience, because I didn't really know this society prior to what I kind of knew. And then when we moved to the States, it was not a concept that we really sort of talked about using that term, but it was a concept that came up a lot in talking about just kind of faith and Christianity and how we treat people and how we have dialogue with each other. It's something I learned a lot more about in grad school because I do study legal systems. And so when we think of justice, I'm surprised nobody mentioned law with a future judge in the house. My goodness. I'm surprised nobody mentioned law, but usually people mention law and people getting what they deserve and judges and all of that. And so that's very much baked into the concept of justice. And, when I interview people, when I am reading things, I hear a lot about what justice is, again, from folks who are kind of in the know. But it still remains kind of an amorphous concept for a lot of folks. And so of all the terms that people use in all of these spheres, I would not have said probably 8 years ago, these long 8 years, Randy's right, a lot has happened in those long 8 years. I would not have said 8 years ago that it was something that I would personally spend as much time thinking about as I probably do on a daily basis right now. And so I did not anticipate necessarily coming back to Ouachita at the time that I did. My husband and I had always said we would love to live in Arkansas, but we kind of thought that would be a someday in many decades type of thing. So fortuitously, providentially, we came back in 2014, and Ouachita was in the middle of thinking about creating a social justice studies program. The Dean of Christian Studies had really kind of led that, and several folks from that school, in terms of thinking about this increasing concern that they saw in students with major world kind of issues. And so thinking about ministering to students or to people's individual pain, but then also collective pain. And students were really interested in things like fighting against human trafficking, or fighting various sorts of things that they saw in the world. And another thing we think about with justice sometimes is fighting. It often goes with peace, but people think of it sometimes as a very fighting or combating-oriented thing, which I would argue it's not necessarily. So I was kind of in this space at this time when this was going forward, and became involved with the planning of that, and then have been fortunate enough to get to work with students in the program. And we're not really sure where that's going to lead or what that sort of holds for the future. We're doing some reevaluations in some senses, but one of the things that I have found in working with this is that we do have these vastly different conceptions. And so in our program, we called it social justice because that's what other schools were doing. Philander Smith and U of A and John Brown have social justice programs, and so there's a nomenclature for that. It's a Jesuit word, actually, a term that emerged in the Roman Catholic Church and among Jesuit folks in particular who were really interested in meeting people's physical needs. And so in the last probably decade or so, around the time that we were working with this, it's a word that's also become very charged in some ways. But apart from that, when we think about doing justice, we get to see that in a lot of different concepts. And so for a lot of the folks who I work with, that means trying to end something or trying to fight something. So this idea, I think, especially for young folks, of we're going to fight something and we're going to end this. And for a lot of folks, that means trying to create like a right, peaceful system. So justice means harmony for some folks. It means peace for some folks. It means a lack of conflict for some folks. And that's not a new thing. Debates about the meaning of the term or what it means are absolutely not new. When Plato and Aristotle were talking about this, I think part of what they were talking about was trying to think through what some of these concepts mean. And so that's something that folks do very much in not just a theoretical realm, but also a very real sort of practical and pragmatic realm at the same time. And I just wanted to offer a couple of thoughts about some of the things that we have seen, not just sort of in my academic work, but kind of personally as well in some of these spheres and trying to connect the personal to the academic. Dr. King did not just say that justice rolls down like water, but here's another audience participation. What's the other famous quote of his that always gets quoted about justice? Does anybody know? Has to do with the... Oh, no, that's a good one, though. I forgot about it. Dang it, what was injustice anywhere is a thought to... Yes, that's a quote that I forgot about. Oh, I'm so embarrassed now. That's a great quote, actually, and he does often get quoted on that. There's another one. It has to do with an arc. Yes, what is it? The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I was telling a group of students that that's a really difficult quote for us. I was actually on a panel on Dr. King Day. And so, everyone kind of has a quote they put on Facebook on that day. You see that one a lot. And the thing is that people really want to get toward the end of that quote a lot of times, right? But it bends toward justice. So we know that justice is coming. We know that justice, whatever we believe that it is, and there are all these different concepts of it, is out there somewhere. But the part that I sort of focused on was the fact that the arc of the universe is long. The moral arc of the universe is long. And the problem with that quote is what? Why do we want to leave out the first part? There's a lot of unhappiness. There's a lot of work involved. There's a lot of suffering involved, right? So I actually used that quote at this panel I was at and was trying to use that as a means of encouragement, right? So we're going to get to justice, but it's a long, long arc, and we might not see it in our lifetimes. And somebody asked in the audience, well, what do we do with this? And is that just something we're saying to placate people, right? Because if we say, well, it's long, then maybe we don't really have to do anything with it. Maybe we kind of get out of some of the tough stuff. Maybe we just excuse people's pain because one day we'll magically be out of pain, right? The context in which that quote originated is one where, of course, the person who is speaking these words understands that they're probably not going to see justice in many senses in their lifetime, right? And so that's, I think, a really tough thing that is very challenging for us about justice. So justice is long. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of pain, right? Justice is also something that is difficult for us, I think, a lot of times because it takes a lot of other perspectives. And so, again, taking quotes in context, and I was so glad to see Micah 6:8, or part of it right here. The thing that we sometimes jump to with Micah 6:8 is the doing justice, and I think this is very American, right? We get to do something, we get to be active, we get to be making change for the better, however we believe that change is coming, right? But what are the other parts of that? There are two other things that we have to do. love mercy and walk humbly, right? Very good. So I asked you what justice meant. What does it maybe mean? I think the pastors actually have to be exempt from this because they've had a lot of training and study. I don't know. You guys can answer. Why not? What does it mean to love mercy, or kindness sometimes is the translation? Fine, we'll let the pastors answer. They don't have answers. You guys have answers for everything. You don't. So one of the interpretations of this, thinking about loving mercy or loving kindness, is this very concept that we see in the New Testament of loving your enemy too, right? Or loving or understanding when things don't work exactly the way that they're supposed to, and extending that in various settings. And then the second part of that is to walk humbly, right? To walk humbly. So to walk humbly with your God. So God has not abandoned us. God is still here. But to walk humbly with your God and to understand that there are these things that we really don't know. And I think in many ways that makes justice a lot less amorphous and it makes it a lot less scary, right? So we're thinking about, again, big concepts, things that we can't even really figure out a definition for in the course of a semester in a college classroom. And some students don't even know after 4 years. They're like, oh my gosh, the definition's even more murky now. But loving kindness, or loving mercy or kindness, and walking humbly with your God really asks actually for this understanding of other people and an understanding of maybe the fact that we may not even know what God wants as we're walking this path that is long, even if it ultimately bends toward justice. And I think in a way that makes it so incredibly relevant. For our time, we hear again today a lot of folks yelling about justice and injustice and what that is or what that means or how these terms kind of work. And that is something that I think for those of us who study this in various contexts, again, for myself just looking at this as maybe a legal concept as well, is something that kind of helps us to take a step back and to understand that there is that greater sort of space. So the question, though, is how to do all of those things, to know the moral arc of the universe is long, even if it does bend toward justice, to know that we've got to love mercy and walk humbly, even though we've also, in order to work in tough situations, got to kind of also move forward, and that takes a certain amount of confidence too. And to understand that maybe sometimes there are different ways of advocating for people that sometimes involve like a self-advocacy and sometimes involve an other advocacy. So I thought about justice a lot this last month, and not in the way that y'all probably are thinking. A lot has changed in the last 8 years. A lot has also changed in the last month in my house. I moved. I brought home a new child. My husband and I actually had 4 kids during the pandemic, so that was a big change for us. And it says at the bottom of this biography, it talks about my 4 human children and my 3 beloved fur babies. The beginning of last month, I had 3 dogs. Today I have 1 dog living at my house, and that is because on the morning of March 15th, the Ides of March, 2 of our dogs got out, and they crossed the street, which they never do, and they got hit by a truck. And my husband and I love our dogs. We grew up moving. Our dogs were like our siblings. It was a really tough and honestly traumatic thing for us, and I don't want to minimize that in talking about animals because I have also lost people during these last 2 years, but it was kind of a tough end to a long few years. And my daughter, when we got in the car, my daughter is 15, and she said, well, we need justice. Where's the justice? Were there cameras? Can we find the person? Are they going to jail? And I said, we'll never know who did this. This is either somebody who didn't care and was just like, I'm just going to run over 2 dogs, or somebody who felt really bad about it and it kind of ruined their day and they're feeling super guilty, and piling on them is not going to be, something that helps. My sister, when I talked to her that night, she's a veterinarian, and she was like, well, the justice system could be very helpful. And she talked about how in many jurisdictions, it's illegal to damage someone's property and run off, and pets are considered property, and we could call the cops, and I was just like, I can't do that. But they both had this idea of justice as something that was like very vengeful and very powerful. And an interesting thing kind of happened over the course of the next month, because I thought, I'm just not in a space to do that. I can't do that. I'm sad. I'm moving. I have there's just too much going on. It's the end of the semester. Like, I can't think about calling the cops to try to get them to take seriously the fact that our 2 dogs died. But about a month later, I kind of got on that train. I was kind of in that sort of realm of thinking about justice and thinking about sort of our dogs and their lives, and I used to see them every day. One of our dogs we had for 12 years, and I just started thinking about justice, 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 justice. And it was a really interesting sort of wake-up call, again, for me personally, of all the weird things to really kind of set this in over the last month. It was a really interesting wake-up call over the ways that we sometimes get really mad about somebody else's injustice and sometimes fail to get mad about our own, and how that's not necessarily always a bad thing. I think sometimes in the United States especially, we talk about fighting for your rights, fighting for the rights of maybe the people who are like us or around us. And what was particularly striking actually for me that day was that I realized it was very strange to kind of feel the way that my daughter had felt on March 15th, and it was even stranger to kind of see the way that she had felt on March 15th. My sister loved our dogs. My daughter did not. Our older dog was probably about 15. She didn't have a lot of life left, even before the truck came along. My daughter used to sort of talk about how glad she was going to be when the dog died, actually. And so it was very strange on that day to be like, justice, justice. And I was like, you didn't even like her. You really wanted her to die. What are you doing? And it took me a while to kind of figure out what was going on there. But she was really genuinely upset, I think, just because my husband and I were upset. She was so upset for us. And so justice for her became this very, I have to do something. And it was an interesting thing because I think the way that she processed it was to think of it as an emotional connection for us. And so this is another thing that justice is something that I think is best born out of an emotional connection to us, or a spiritual connection to God or to the people around us. I think sometimes, though, when we think we're doing justice, it's something that helps us to avoid emotional connection as well. And I lived, I lived in Washington, D.C. My husband is from that area. My in-laws, as many of you know, still live in that area for a while. And we knew a lot of people who were doing justice in the long term. But they were so focused on the long arc that there was no sort of short arc, right? There were, these sorts of people who they were maybe working to create justice for, but didn't necessarily want to interact with as well. I helped during my time there to run a community garden, and we had these big debates about what happened because some people would water the plants, and then other people would harvest the plants, and then they got all the food, and the people who had done all the work hadn't. And usually the people who were doing the watering were people who had quite a few more resources than the people who were harvesting. And so several times we said, well, why don't we just look at this as an act of justice and a thing where we can, kind of be providing for our neighbors, and where those of us who have can help contribute, and those who need can just have this opportunity. And people said, but I care about justice, and I care about what people don't have because I work at A, B, and C nonprofit, and I sit at a desk all day and I look at pictures of hungry kids, and now I don't want to have to do this when I come home. And so I think that sometimes justice can also be a way for us to disconnect. And I think that that's really what Micah is, in my opinion, it's so intimidating with pastors sitting on the front row. Really asking us to do is to look at justice as something that is connective, right? It's deeply connective. That's not necessarily how we look at it culturally today. It's something that sort of we invoke when we want to be right, and it's something that we sometimes invoke when we want to fight with people. But justice for Micah is deeply connective, right? And so for my daughter on March 15th, she found a way that she wanted to connect with us. For some of the folks who we have known who didn't want to connect with people, justice actually becomes a way of saying, well, I can sort of minimize the person I see in front of me in order to more or sort of differently engage, right? I'm solving this long problem. I'm bending the moral arc of the universe. And so there's not as much connection that I have to have there. And so I think that is really helpful for us and really informative in thinking about justice as something that is not just seen here, but again, seen in spaces where we're asked to just let it be generous and let it roll down. And there is a sense in which justice is something that is meant to be shared and meant to be very abundant, right? One of those things that we're asked to have very abundantly. And so as we think about justice, I think it is important for us to think about it not as something that is an intellectual exercise or something that we can own or know or use as support for what we're doing, but thinking about it as something that is actually meant to be very much shared, right? And that might not just include things like access to resources. It might not just include things like making sure that we all have what we need physically, but it might actually mean thinking together about this very definition of justice itself that is so, so tricky for us a lot of times. So that is a little bit about what I have learned about justice. And I think I have left plenty of time for us to be able to discuss that together or to sort of answer questions or think a little bit more about some of this together. I'll stand here ticking like a clock, because I can't stand still. Any questions? Comments?
What would your dream be in Washington? What would you like to see? You said there's a conversation about possible changes. What's one thing you would like to see change?
Oh, goodness. That's a big question. What is my dream? What would I like to see changed at Washington? Oh, for the social justice program, yes. I assumed that was baked into the question. I think if I were to want to see anything, it would be, I think it would be a little bit more listening. I think, sometimes, whether it's inside or outside of the program, we don't always listen to each other when we're thinking about these definitions of what we want things to be. And that can lead to a lot of assumptions about what's happening or not happening or kind of how that goes. And so that's a tough thing because it's not something that you can just fix with a, curriculum change. It is something that's a lot harder and takes a lot more work and patience and humility and conversation. But I think that would be, it would be just more, a more common understanding for folks about what we're doing, which doesn't always mean the same understanding or everyone being on the same page, but just an ability to sort of listen to each other on what that means sometimes. Yeah.
Do you find that your students, when they come to class, are more hopeful or more discouraged when they talk about how they feel about issues, social justice issues that concern them? Do they have a hope or despair?
It depends on the students. I would say overall they're more hopeful when they come in and more discouraged when they leave, which is kind of part of the point. So, we have a lot of students who come in and know all the answers to fixing the world, as a lot of 18-year-olds do. Teenagers generally. I have a 15-year-old, so she knows all the answers to everything. So, I think we, we do get a lot of folks who are very hopeful, and it's well, I'm going to end homelessness and, these big things that you're just going to do. But we also have some students who have seen some things, whether that is in their own families and communities or whether that is, through, we have a lot of students who do hands-on or mission trips or, will really have to up close and personally see a lot of injustice. And so that's kind of what drives them is this, I feel despair now, but I want to feel hopeful. So I think it really kind of depends. But I think usually we kind of try to work from hope to not despair, but maybe reality, and then back toward some hope, because we do have hope, and I think that's part of faith is understanding that, we do have faith that there will be, justice and that God loves justice and that that's part of it as well, but that it's a difficult and fraught process and not one that they get to automatically. So. Mm-hmm.
And secondly, how did your fellow folks who were there with you, how did they receive your perception, how you reframe that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think part of that was figuring out the demographics and the changes and everything in our neighborhood generally. So the neighborhood, we lived 2 blocks from campus, right by McMillan, and the area that we lived in went through a huge change, beginning probably 3-4 years before we got there, and then afterward it gentrified. It was the fastest gentrifying area in the United States when we lived there. And so I think part of that realization for me was that we actually moved there because my husband and I were both students, and we thought we can afford to live here. And 5 years later, we couldn't have afforded to live there when we left. And so we kind of watched that shift, and I think we watched the reactions of just people around us who were in many cases losing homes that they'd lived in for decades, or just losing, all the community that was around them. And so I think we also felt like, because of maybe our work and just maybe our perspectives, that we saw that a little bit more. So we, went to a church that was really invested in the community and was not that far away, and where people saw these changes. And that was not true of like all the people who were living around us, who were just there to own the world, as people in DC tend to want to do. So I think that we just kind of we're bothered by that, even in our friend circle, where we would sort of hear people talk about like the neighborhood, and we'd always be like, why are they living here? They can go live somewhere else, So I think that was part of that. And I think, honestly, maybe just our backgrounds too. We both grew up, in environments where we were asked very much to understand our communities and to look at the people around us. And so I think a lot of the people who lived around us and who were part of this, well, why are they taking our food type of thing, were people who had probably always lived in spaces where they'd had a lot of space, a lot of like idea about personal space and it being big and wide. And that was just not part of our conception. And so that was a little bit different. And reactions, I think, varied. So one of the things that was interesting/frustrating was the folks who wanted to start the garden and who were on the board really were very communally minded. And so we said, well, we'll have these communal plots where anybody can work and anybody can harvest, and then we'll have some individual plots where people pay $50 a year. It wasn't a lot of money, and by DC standards, not a lot of money at all, to rent their space. And then they've kind of got that, and then people who want to be in the communal kind of space can be in that, and people who want the individual space can have it. But what happened was, first of all, not everyone understood that delineation between communal and public, because it was a community garden and it was in a public park. And then, folks who had private plots still wanted to like put things in the communal space and water it and make sure it worked. And so it was hard, because I think that was really challenging for the board, because a lot of us were pretty like-minded and being like, well, we want this to be a community space. And in fact, it was the site of an old school that had been torn down, and the city gave money to make it a park so that it could be a community space, and that was one of the parameters for starting the garden. And so I think the board was pretty committed to that. But people would sometimes just say, okay, well, I'm going somewhere else, and we actually had a waiting list for plots, so it's not a problem. If you want to take your $50 and go somewhere else, you can go somewhere else, but you still live in the middle of a city where there are other people. And sometimes people would just get really insistent. So we lived in a space where DC is a very global city. People speak a lot of different languages, and not everyone speaks English, and the signs were all in English. And we said, well, maybe there's a communication issue, and people are like, no, everybody knows full well what they're doing. They know these are our plots, and they know that they're taking our food. And so some people just kind of get huffy and insistent and continue to be thorns in our sides. Some people, would be like, well, we just want to bring this up. I watered the tomatoes on Saturday, and then I was going to go back and pick them Sunday, and there were none left. And, we were like, well, maybe when you're watering them, you can pick some if you want to. And so, there was a range of reactions from kind of huffy to, okay, now I kind of understand what's going on. And we did get that sometimes, where people would be like, oh, okay, well, I didn't understand that this was kind of a communal space, which is a crazy thing to think, but I think that's also kind of how that worked. So, yeah, that's a bit rambly, but I hope it kind of answered that. So. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right.
How do we help people think about justice proactively? The things that we do and the systems we inhabit that foster instances that make that possible.
Mm-hmm.
I love what you said about justice not being combative but connected. And I feel like that's connected to helping people think about justice as wholeness.
Right. Yeah. That's a great question. So in an immediate me sense, one of the things I try to do is to be proactive about, if we understand that many people think of justice as punitive and reactive, trying to be proactive about not making it that. And so one of the things like I do on the first day, I have a class where, I have a lot of classes actually where we discuss difficult things. I teach about atrocity, I teach about apartheid. And so one of the things that I do a lot of times on a first day of class is to go through some training on what we call brave spaces. So we talk about safe spaces a lot, but brave spaces where you feel able to kind of talk and connect. And so there are a few sort of tenets that we talk through, and one of those is to say, we all come from different spaces, so we're going to have different opinions about this, and that's okay. Disagreement is actually a natural thing. It's okay. We talk about, kind of a two before me rule, where a couple other people have to speak before you speak, and then if nobody speaks, you can kind of jump back in, because you've always got that person who wants to keep being in the conversation. We talk about not personally attacking people, and not attacking ideas as well, but kind of using that language where you say, I was really bothered by that idea, versus, how could you possibly say this, you jerk? And so I think that in an interpersonal sense, that sets a lot of the stage for being able to think more about justice. And so I think that I increasingly think of justice as something that is communicative, and so that really helps us, I think, to be able to communicate and to not, to do that. And I try to do it in kind of a humorous way too. So it's not like, I think you guys are going to fight, so let me talk about this. But it's like, hey, here are some things that none of you are going to do, but let's just abstractly talk about them, and that helps a lot of problems. I think in a larger sense, a lot of my academic work now is focusing a lot more on sort of post-conflict justice, so what happens in the afterward. And interestingly enough, one of the sort of four major tenets of transitional justice and thinking about getting to a new place is that you have to think about how this can't happen again. And I feel like that's something we trot out a lot, never again. I was teaching about the Holocaust this week, so we were talking about how people say never again. But that also is really just a bigger part of that conversation that's kind of proactive and says, what are the potential flashpoints here? And so in the wake of a genocide, maybe that's racial or ethnic tension, or maybe that does have to do with resources, maybe that has to do with some type of communication thing. And so I think in those senses, sometimes there are physical things that need to be, fixed or addressed or worked on. Sometimes there are ways of just kind of communicating that to folks. And so whether that is, trying to find some, common ground on, something that you may not seem to have a common ground on. But that's the part that's really sort of, I think, difficult, because it almost does require that to kind of precipitate it, and then to sort of say, okay, well, we'll have justice for next time. And that's part of, I think, what's challenging about it, because historically, most of the times when we see justice, it is posited as knowing that there's injustice in the world. And so I think getting toward it in some ways almost always has to be reactive, because it's just kind of trying to move, away from that space. There's no space where we have a super clean slate, but I think just, communication really is kind of, I think, in both that interpersonal and both that societal place where that happens a lot. So I'm going to quote one of the premier social scientists that Washita has ever had, Dr. Hal Bass, and say, it depends. Most of our students are Christian coming into Washita, but not all of them. There's a variety of different faith traditions students follow, and many who either don't have faith or are not Christian. So it really does depend. A lot of our students hear about justice in their churches, and that's why they're interested in it. A lot of them do not, and that's why they're interested in it. And so some students want what they think they've had, what they think works, and some students think that what they heard was not correct, and they kind of want something else. And I think one thing that is really important and meaningful to a lot of them is being able to work through that in a Christian context. And I think a lot of these debates, these debates being the whatever big issues people debate, I think our students do tend to find that if they have those in kind of a non-faith-based context, it becomes a very like, well, Christians don't like justice and, everyone else does, and it really kind of becomes a very polarizing kind of anti-church thing. And so I think that one of the comments that I get often from the seniors is that they appreciate having an opportunity to think through that in a faith-based environment, and to talk about their faith as part of justice, and to understand that is part of, God's plan for us. And then continuing after that, again, it really depends. Like, we have had quite a few graduates who are double majors, like in Christian studies, and are interested in ministry and missions, so they're obviously going to remain involved in churches. We've had some graduates who probably, coming into this were not as interested in remaining active in church and probably haven't. But yeah, there's a range, and it really does depend. So, yeah. So pre-pandemic and sort of this year, we tried to kind of, get them in touch with people. So students in our program are required to do a certain number of community service hours. So we have a center on campus that facilitates community service, and so we do ask in the intro course and then throughout their time that they do community service and engage with people, so they see justice and injustice. We also have done things like, do retreats. So we went to DC and we saw a variety of different folks too. Sort of in addition to advocacy and action, we've gone to Houston, we've come to Little Rock, and just kind of connected with folks here. And so we do ask them to, meet with people and kind of understand that in a very real sense. And I think that is helpful for them too, in sort of thinking through, for some of our students vocationally, for some of them personally, just kind of thinking about how you do justice, and how, again, that's a long-term project, which for 18-year-olds is something that's really sometimes novel and sometimes not. Again, we come in with students who understand that really well, and then sometimes there are students who are still working on kind of understanding that, but just trying to expose them to a variety of different avenues in which people have thought about justice. Yeah. That's a great question. I think one of the first things I would say is kind of counterintuitive, which is to maybe take a step back from justice, because I think sometimes when that happens too, it's I've got the answer and I know, and so that's why I'm coming into this community. But sometimes I do think that justice comes from a place of, caring about people and, caring about what God wants for people. And so sometimes I think just listening maybe to what people in a community think is justice, and then being willing to work with that. And I think one place sometimes people struggle is to be like, well, if I work with it, am I supporting something that I don't want to support, and all of that. And I do think that part of loving people is loving people unconditionally, and, working with kind of community needs that might be very different than what we think they are. So I think that's a lot of it. I think, just having humility, and I do think that that's part of thinking about justice and faith too, and where we sometimes let ourselves off the hook, but it's also useful to, understand that maybe, we don't have the answers and we're not going to solve things, and so that kind of maybe takes away some of that, like, well, I've got to do this and I've got to fix this, and I don't have time to engage with you because I got to fix it. There's a book I've used before called The World Is Not Ours to Save, and he talks about a couple of things in there. One of those is the idea that doing too much kind of takes us away from really focusing on God. And the person who wrote it is an anti-nuclear activist. And so he's like, I've devoted my 30-year career to getting rid of nukes, and I know I'm not going to do it, but for me, I have to. He's also a priest. And so he talks about how, that mentality sort of of, I've got to just get things done and do justice kind of takes you away from like seeing God as in control, but it also takes away from seeing beauty in the world, because the world is just a project and something to be fixed. And so one of the things that he really recommends is to sort of step back and to see beauty also. And I think that's part of listening is seeing beauty in communities that you want to work in too. And, maybe seeing that before seeing that need for justice. And I think that is in some ways a hard question for me to answer, because I grew up overseas with parents who are missionaries, and I feel like we had very early conversations about being in communities. I work now with a lot of students who go into communities that may have like less resources or less privileges than they do, and who are just that's the thing they notice, they're like so taken away by it. And so it is kind of hard, I think, in that sense to like step back and to see beauty, because I felt like growing up I always saw beauty and I loved playing with my friends, and then it's like, oh yeah, and people don't have the resources, that everyone has. And so that's honestly, I think, a hard one, because I'm sure that it can be taught, but I don't really know, how we do that. But I think generally just, listening and trying to, trying to make that justice maybe unconditional and finding that beauty too. And remembering that we're ultimately not in charge, which is, again, not something to let us off the hook, but something that's also kind of comforting and helpful sometimes.
You may have just answered this question, but I was thinking, other than like Bible, maybe the resource you just named, if there was one text that you would ask others to read, multi-generational, multicultural, multi-ethnic group of folks to read, that would invite them to observe and respond, possibly respond to the call to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly, what would that be?
Goodness. I have to say I've had trouble finding just one ever. But that's a really good one. There's another really good one called Advocating for Justice, and Stephen Offit is one of the authors. There are like 7 authors. It's one of those et al. And it's specifically written about evangelicals and justice, and kind of because there is sometimes people will be like, well, if you care about justice, you don't care about God, and so it's written very much in a context for Christians too. So those are really good general ones. There are probably things about other specific elements of justice. I'm trying to think of what I assign if it's just like a good overall thing. There are things that deal with like theoretically what it is, but I'm sort of much less theoretical. So I know a lot of people use like Sandel's Justice book that kind of talks about concepts, which I have to admit for me is a little bit abstract, but there are people who really like it and are like, oh, this is what justice is. So maybe that one, if that floats your boat. But I was just having this conversation with a missionary kid yesterday. You had a camera on the wall or something. I think it's it's still a hard thing for me personally, honestly. I think, again, everybody's different and it depends, but I think there are a lot of people who do kind of struggle with this idea that sometimes, faith or action seems very cheap. I think Americans do tend to want easy solutions to problems. And want things to be fixed. And so I think that one thing that kind of frustrates, a lot of, MKs or TCKs is kind of seeing people be like, okay, well, I'm going to go build a house for somebody and then it's going to be okay. And so I think those things are tough. I think one of the dualities of being a missionary kid is that you feel like you're so invested in churches, but then you also don't really know what's going on. And so a lot of the like theological debates that people have, I still don't understand. A lot of like American church politics and things like that. And so I think you kind of get here and you're like, oh, I think I know churches pretty well. Like I grew up going to them. My parents are missionaries. And then it's like, oh, I have no idea what's happening. And I think that can definitely be a frustration. I think it can be a frustration to see, I think people see justice or just being with people as something that you can just kind of cut off, right? So I kind of did my volunteer hours and now I'm off the clock and it's not like a constant reality for people. So yeah, I think those are big struggles for somebody. The person I was talking to yesterday was just talking about how, they didn't really say which situation, but the way that they talked, it sort of sounded like, all the suffering that we've seen in Ukraine over the last month. And they said they sort of would bring that up with people and they'd be like, oh yeah, it's really sad. Okay, let's go get some pizza, And so those things I think are very tough because it does seem disconnected for people. Even though obviously there is a lot of suffering in the United States, I think there are ways to not have to see that in the United States. And in some parts of the United States that's not true, but in a lot of environments that can be true. So yeah, I think that's a difficult thing for a lot of people. I think sometimes the United States is kind of like Disneyland. That's kind of how my siblings and I felt, because you get to go to McDonald's, you get to see, your grandparents buy you things because they haven't seen you for several years. You can kind of, have all this candy available to you. So there's a little bit of that, but I think that, yeah, that really is a struggle for sure. Your turn. Oh, I did say that. I am open to sharing it, although it changes. I think that my overall definition for justice would be thinking of a world where we co-create, which is a word that one of my colleagues uses, but where we co-create opportunity and fairness for each other. So it's not something that any one of us instills, but where we do have to work together and communicate for that. But it does change sometimes. Yes, sir. Yeah, I have definitely dealt with that and seen that. And yeah, that's another one of those hard questions because I think my first experience really dealing with that actually I lived on the East Coast for 7 years, and I have a degree from Ouachita Baptist University in Arkadelphia, Arkansas. So people make all kinds of, I don't even have to tell them I'm Christian, just tell them where I went to school. People make all kinds of assumptions about that. And I think, the first time I had that experience, it was so jarring. I was like, oh, I don't even know what to do with this person, but it was something I became a little more acclimated to. And I think the best, I don't know if this is a real answer. I just kind of try to be myself across those contexts. And so I think that the person who, when I had that first experience coming to the East Coast, I guess they sort of asked what I was interested in academically, and I told them, and they asked how that came about, and I talked about growing up overseas, and then they said, well, how'd you grow up overseas? And I said, my parents are missionaries, and they said, are you religious? And I said, yes, I'm a Christian. And they said, oh my gosh, well, you just think I'm going to hell, and all these things. And we wound up being really good friends 2 years later, and it wasn't necessarily because of any grand thing that either of us did. I think we just got used to being in the same space for a while, and then we had friends in common, and then we sort of talked. And so I think a lot of times there's some level of patience and some level of just kind of being authentic too, because I think that sometimes people's ideas are formed by their experiences and sometimes they're not. And so there are people who have had bad experiences with church and with Christians and who are, feeling that with you. And there are some people who haven't, but they've heard something from somebody or just kind of have, some mindset. But I think, by and large, I've not always, but often found that in, not just talking about faith, but in any setting where we don't understand each other or we have assumptions about each other, I think just kind of being in the space, and again, maybe going back to the going into communities question, just kind of listening and not having an agenda is really helpful. And I think that, again, part of how we think about justice is as something that has like a cause and a cost. And so, if you're in a volunteer situation, maybe that's just showing up and doing the things just like everybody else, or continuing to have those conversations. Because I also don't think that it means not advocating for yourself, because I've also heard people say, well, all Christians only do this or that. And it's like, well, I don't do this or that, and I don't care about that. So, I think, definitely saying that. But, I think treating those divides and those differences as real, but also maybe not being scared to try to, again, just be in the space and see how relationships develop maybe over time, which is maybe not helpful because sometimes you don't have time. But, yeah, I definitely have gotten that, and that's... I don't know that there's a fully formed answer for that, but yeah. Does anybody have a different idea about what justice is now that you've gone through all the things? I didn't have 4 years with you to change your minds, or even a semester. Not that we always have to change our minds. Sometimes the things we thought were not the wrong things to begin with. Or is that my cue? Thank you guys very much.
Thank you. We're going to take a few minutes to have a break if you need to make a pit stop, or just want to visit with your neighbors, or you may have a question you did not want to ask, and Myra was going to be here, and you want to kind of pigeonhole her, whatever. But we will gather back here in about 11 minutes, if that's okay. All right. And for those of you who are on the live stream, just take a few minutes, but we will be back at 7:45 for our business session.
join us as well. So if you will be doing that. If you are live streaming and you have been involved in meetings like this, you are aware that once you let people up, it's hard to get them back down. So we'll take just a moment to do that, and then we will resume. And while we are asking you to do that, let me once again thank our friends here at Second Baptist Church for their wonderful hospitality to Preston, his staff, and the volunteers. We thank you very much for having us here tonight. In a few moments, Jay Heflin, our moderator, is going to lead a panel discussion after our business with our 5 representatives who are on the governing board of our merger, and they're going to answer questions about that. But and I'm sure that he will be identifying who they are when that time comes. But one thing that I would like to ask is a favor of you, not only here in this gathering in person, but also if you're watching by means of YouTube or Facebook. The General Assembly of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship Global meets in Dallas the last week in June. And if you are planning to go, if you've already registered or you're just thinking about it and have not yet done so, would you do me a favor? Would you let me know that? Because we're trying to work out a tri-state meeting during the assembly with the folks from Mississippi and Louisiana, and it would really be helpful to me to kind of get a count of how many people we're going to have from Arkansas. It's very easy for you to let me know. My email address is rhyde@cbfar.org. And if you will just email me and let me know that you plan to come or are thinking about it, I would really appreciate that very much. I'm going to lead us in a word of prayer, and when I do that, after I do that, Preston Clegg, the pastor here at Second Baptist, is going to come and give instructions as to how those of you who are live streaming can participate in our business meeting as well as in the panel discussion. And he will give you instructions how to use the comments and chat features that are available for that. And during the business meeting, then, of course, Jay Heflin, our moderator, will lead that portion of it. So let's pray together. Father, we understand that sometimes business can be kind of dull. It's just kind of matter of fact. But it also can inspire. It can encourage us in the work to which we've been called. Help us to do that tonight as we seek to be the presence of Christ in our community, to do that which indeed involves justice and mercy and kindness, we ask in Christ's name. Amen. Preston.
So we have 2 online platforms that you can engage this business session tonight, and we have hosts on both platforms. So you can go to Second Baptist Church Little Rock's Facebook page, or you can go to our YouTube channel. Come to think of it, if you're watching this, you're already in one of those places. So if you want to cast a vote tonight, just in the comment, name yourself and make your vote. So it's a weird world, y'all. Yes. Okay. So there's a delay in the room. We'll give you time to vote, but we want your voices to be heard and recorded, and really the quorum necessitates that. So please vote. Just identify yourself and either affirm or negate your vote. Jay?
Thank you, Preston. Appreciate it. Thank you all for being here. We're excited about being able to have Dr. Hauser here with us tonight, and excited about the panel discussion and the business meeting. I promise we will do our best to get through as quickly as possible. Dad always said, make sure you start on time, which we're a couple of minutes late, but make sure you finish on time. So we will definitely do that. So as I call the spring meeting of the CBF Arkansas to order, I we have minutes of the February meeting, and we present those to you for your record. They don't need to be approved by a vote, but we wanted you to have a copy of those for your record. We also have a finance report, and I wanted to let you know where we were through 8 months. That's through February. Our fiscal year, as you know, is July 1 through June 30. And we have updated financials through February, and I wanted to give you an update of where we were. So Randy, as you all know, is our interim director and has jumped in with both feet and is doing a wonderful job these last 3.5 months, or now 4 months, because we're all the way through April. But through our first 8 months of the year, we are roughly, through 8 months, we're at roughly 58% of our budgeted revenues raised. So a little behind from a per month basis, but still doing very well. Our church contributions are actually ahead of budget, and our individual contributions are slightly behind. The advantage that we have is that, not the advantage, but the other thing is on the expense side of the aisle, you always worry about your revenues and then also your expenses. With our expenses, we are spending less than we have brought in, which is always a good thing. And so through the 8 months, we have brought in more revenue than money that we've spent. So we're ahead from a revenue over expenses standpoint through those first 8 months, and we're excited about that. Wanted to let you know where we were. Any questions or comments about the finance report? Okay. Next on the agenda is the 2022-2023 budget recommendation. This again has been approved by the executive committee, and we just wanted to let you know what we were going to do for the upcoming fiscal year. As you know, and as the panel will talk to us about shortly, the merger discussions, or the merger's been approved by all 3 states, and the governing board is working feverishly to get everything worked on so we can start as a full region as soon as possible. Therefore, it's your executive board's decision to continue in the 2022-23 fiscal year with the same budget that we had in the 2021-22 fiscal year. We figured there was no reason to make any changes with that, expecting not to finish the 2022-23 fiscal year because the new region will be in place before that happens. Any comments or questions about that? Any cause for concern there from anybody, either online or in the room? Okay, hearing none. We will move to the next item on the agenda. We do have a recommendation, and this will call for a vote from those in the room and those online. A recommendation concerning the coordinating council. It is your executive committee's recommendation that we continue, and we ask the current coordinating council to serve an additional year. So all of those that are on the coordinating council, they have been contacted and asked and have all agreed, pending this vote, to serve an additional year on the coordinating council. The officers will continue in the same process that we normally do. So at the end of this meeting, Joni Lee, who is our current moderator-elect, will become moderator, and Beverly McCollum, who is our current recorder, will remain as recorder. And then Rod Torrance, who is the past moderator, will become the past moderator, and I will become past moderator. So that's what will happen with the officers. So now I would entertain a motion. I think we need to do that in two separate votes, one for the officers and then one for the council. So if I could have a motion to approve the council being the same for one more year. Thank you, Jim. If I could have a second. Thank you, Hal. So we have a motion and a second. Are there any questions or is there any discussion? Okay, all those in favor, please say aye. Thank you. Any opposed, same sign. Okay, for the officers, I would also entertain a motion to approve the officers. Thank you. And a second? Thank you. So moved and seconded. Any other questions or comments or discussion? All those in favor, please raise your hand. Any opposed, same. Thank you. Both motions were passed unanimously. Thank you for your votes. So the next thing on the agenda is a grant update. We made you aware in the February meeting that, let me find my page so that I speak correctly. So in honor of our 25th celebration a few years ago, this is meeting number 29. So 4 years ago, CBF Global had a campaign where they raised quite a bit of money, and part of that fundraising or capital campaign was to be able to provide grants to various states. And Arkansas has received over the last 3 years $100,000 from CBF Global. $33,000 of that in year one, $33,000 in year two, and $34,000 in year three. So we've spent that over the last 3.5 years, and we've spent it with three primary areas. With three primary areas being the focal points. One of those is global missions and Together for Hope. The second is a Healthy Churches initiative, and the third is around young Baptist leaders. So we've been pleased to be able to spend those dollars in those three particular ways over the last 3.5 years. As Ray approached his retirement at the end of 2021, we had a fair amount of money from the last $34,000 that CBF Global had provided. So we wanted to come up with some good ways to spend those dollars, which we did. $10,000 of that went Together for Hope Arkansas, and another $1,000 from our regular budget. Beginning in 2022. Upon Randy's arrival as our interim coordinator, we had $16,000, just over $16,000 left in that grant. The grant advisory committee that was set up by Ray included the current moderator, the moderator-elect, who's also the finance chair of CBF Arkansas, and 2 past moderators. So at the beginning of 2022, we had $16,000 left, and as we mentioned in the February meeting, we made a gift of $5,000 to the Emmanuel McCall Racial Justice Initiative, and another $1,500 gift to the Passport Camps. It was part of an initiative by the Passport Camps celebrating their 30th anniversary, and they asked churches across the U.S. to support their campaign, and Arkansas CBF gave $1,500 to that. So the McCall Racial Justice Initiative was part of the Global Missions and Together for Hope piece of the three areas that we give funds for, and obviously the Passport gift was for young Baptist leaders. Then the Russian invasion of the Ukraine happened in mid-February after our meeting, and as you all are well aware, CBF Global has set up a relief fund to help support our neighbors in the Ukraine. So your grant advisory committee made the decision to provide a $5,000 gift to the relief fund that CBF Global had set up for the Ukraine, with $2,000 of that being designated for refugee work being done by the McNairys in Slovakia. So $3,000 went directly to the relief fund, and $2,000 went straight to the McNairys in Slovakia for their refugee work. We wanted to make you aware of that gift that has happened since our February meeting, just so you'll be aware of it. This leaves a balance in that grant fund of just over $4,600. So those dollars will be spent because those are, I'll say those are Arkansas dollars as opposed to regional dollars, and your grant advisory committee will work with Randy and the rest of the coordinating council to come up with good avenues to spend that money. Any suggestions that any of the coordinating council has or any CBF Arkansas members have that fit into those three categories, we would certainly love to hear those. And we will be making that decision over the next, probably before the end of the calendar year, but certainly before the end of the 2022-23 fiscal year. Any questions or comments about that? Okay. The last item of business that we have is Randy and Joni and I met with Preston on Monday of this week to discuss this meeting, making sure that we had all the last minute details taken care of. And Joni and Preston relayed to Randy and me that the new regional governing board that's been meeting several times over the last couple of months since they've been established has come to the conclusion that there's a lot of work that they need to be doing. And so while there are 5 individuals from each state, they all three states thought that it would be a really good idea to add a 6th member from each state to help with that workload. So at the recommendation of our CBF Arkansas representatives from our CBF Arkansas representatives for the governing council, the nominating committee has asked Chester Thompson from Camden to be that 6th member, and he has graciously accepted to do that pending this vote. So I would entertain I will say that it has been unanimously approved by your nominating committee, and it comes to you today as a recommendation from that nominating committee. Therefore, since it comes from a standing committee, it does not require a second by the coordinating council. So I will entertain any discussion or questions, comments that you may have. Hearing none, I would ask for all that are in favor, please let it be known by raising your hand. Any opposed? Unanimous approval. Thank you. Chester, thank you very much for agreeing to serve. Okay, so that is the end of the agenda that we have for tonight. We did want to leave as much time as possible for the panel, which we worked hard on getting the meeting done quickly. Thank you for your help with that. Is there any other business that needs to come before the council this evening? Hearing none, we stand adjourned. And I would ask that the council now come to the stage, and we'll begin that part of the meeting. Panel discussion. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Chester, we thought about putting an extra chair up here for you too, just to make you feel the pressure. Okay, so our purpose of this conversation tonight is just for you to be able to ask questions about what's going on with the new governing board, how the meetings are going, what the process is like. And so we will open it up for questions. I would introduce each of the people, but since Randy's already started the process of not reading from the program, I will let you know that their personal information is in the program, and you would know all of these individuals already. Anyway, that's true. I will let them introduce themselves. very quickly, just with a quick introduction of your name and maybe one quick thing about you.
I'm Demetria Edwards, and I live in Lake Village, Arkansas, down in southeast Arkansas.
And I'm Mike Mullally. I'm a member of First Baptist Jonesboro.
And I'm Joni Lee, and I'm from Pulaski Heights Baptist here in Little Rock.
Preston Clegg, right here, Second Baptist Little Rock.
And I'm Hal Bass, First Baptist Arkadelphia.
Super. Thank each of you for being here tonight. We appreciate your service. So we know this is a time-consuming process, and you've been on lots of Zoom calls and all of that. I'm going to start with one quick question and then open it up to the audience. You've met several times during the last couple of months, and this is for any or all of you. What are your thoughts on these initial meetings? Do the individuals from each state seem to be coming together as a cohesive unit?
I think so. I guess Preston and I were on the original group, the exploratory committee that the three states had for deciding on the merger, and so we were the ones who sort of conceptualized the plan or the proposal that got presented to the three states. So we may have a little bit of a different perspective in that sort of coming out of that group, and a lot of the people from those three states are now on the governing council as we're moving forward. So I think that both in the initial phase and this phase, it struck me how quickly everyone came together around sort of the ideas and the principles that we were laying out, and just the community about wanting to move forward together was striking.
I think our churches have the same passions. Our states have the same needs. Our churches have been doing the same work, whether we realize it or not. And so there's a lot of commonality in that room that only grows as we get to know each other. You know, Zoom meetings are funky to read. It's hard to get to know people that way, but I think we're as close as we can be, having had however many Zoom meetings we've had. What, 4 or 5, something like that? 3, 4, 5?
Yeah, I would just say, I perceive a real commitment to consensus among the 15 that have been serving on this in this group. A real willingness to listen and to, when necessary, find, compromise. No my way or the highway attitudes at all.
And I concur. I think that there's definitely a desire for everyone to come together. I was sharing with Preston just earlier today. I hadn't shared it with the big group. I think there's still also a need for us to fully knit our hearts together. Like he said, it's very hard to do some of that initially through Zoom, but maybe in the future some sort of Bible study, or the reason I was asking her about a text that could have us come together, in this like-minded way to really talk about some things from a sort of objective perspective. I think it would also be helpful in that process of coming together.
And I perceive there's a lot of optimism about new collaborations as we cross state lines, because even with Together for Hope, there are going to be Mississippi churches and Louisiana churches going to come to Helena now, hopefully, and we'll have the opportunity to go to Shaw, Mississippi, and to Lake Providence as well.
Super, thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? So the group was originally established with five areas of focus for the new region. Can you talk about what those are, and do any of those seem to be moving to the front of a priority list?
I think one of the things that has been at the forefront all the way through is racial justice. That's something we want to be incredibly intentional about. One of the reasons we asked to expand our board was to share the work. Another reason is because we feel like it is important for the leadership of this organization to look like the region, and not in a token way, but in a real constitutional way. And so it's, again, we can talk about all the justice and all the things that need to change elsewhere, but until we're doing that work internally with the utmost intention, we're not quite getting at that. So that's something that I've seen all the way through.
And there was a lot of connectivity with the racial justice piece and the priority and the Together for Hope initiative. It's not any secret when you look at the map of the region that we are now in. The Together for Hope sites that there are that Mike just mentioned. But we know that we reside in one of the areas that has the highest level of poverty in the country, and that work and making sure that when we talk about that long arc and the work that's right in front of us, the last 2 years, if it's taught us anything, are the real issues and the day in and day out struggles that we know are faced by many folks in the region that we're in. And so just the connectivity between Together for Hope and racial justice issues were very much prominent in the very beginning of our conversation.
Not much good came out of the pandemic, but what we learned about technology during the pandemic is going to help us as we go forward in terms of this connectivity that Joni's talking about here. We figured out ways and means for people who are apart to come together in workable fashion. And that's one of the things I'm excited about is we're trying to get together and contribute together as we go forward.
One of the 5 priorities was young adult and youth programming. And that one, to me, was one of the most important. I think we all are looking at our congregations and our church communities and understanding that the needs of, young people and the faith practices that we are providing for young people, it looks a lot different, and it's going to look a lot different than it currently does. And I think there was a lot of excitement to have 3 states with churches and youth groups and young leaders now to bounce ideas off of and work on programming together that I know we all struggle, I know we do with our church about activities and things to be able to expose our young people, our youth to, and to have the possibility of now having a region where we could possibly travel and meet with other youth groups or other groups focused on issues that we want to see our kids being raised in the faith, and how that looks different today, and how we can all trade those ideas was, I think, very important, especially moving forward when we think about the future of not just CBF but our faith communities.
Yes, Jim. Okay, so the question for those of you online is there any consensus on where the headquarters of the 3-state region may be?
Not yet, but I have been as candid as I can be in the group, and I'll be just as candid with you today as well. Our leadership model is co-coordinators, so I don't think you will have one headquarters. I think you'll have multiple headquarters, kind of a decentralized leadership. However, if you look at the 3 states, there's one state that actually has an office, like a physical office, and that's us. We have an office that is paid for, like we don't owe money on that, so we wouldn't have to rent space. And if one of our core objectives is racial justice, and we have an office on the corner of an HBCU, then when you put all of that together, I think it would be madness for one of those hubs of leadership not to be where it has been, where Ray's office was, where Randy's office is. And so, I play easy with people, and as Hal said, there's no my way or the highway, but that is something that I will yell and scream about, I guess. I care very deeply about that. And it just makes sense to me, given that we're the state with an office, we have it, and that what that address says missionally, I think is of vital importance to us. Mike can say more about this in a few minutes, I guess. We have talked a little bit about where the organization will be located constitutionally. You know, in the bylaws, you have to constitute your organization in a state. And so the bylaws team, and we'll tell you more about that in just a second, they're thinking about where this region will exist legally, in what state, and what factors will lead us to make that choice. So yeah, I'm confident that one of the hubs of leadership will be where it is, and we're figuring out where the region will be legally and constitutionally.
Thank you for that. So you alluded to it in your answer a second ago. We understand that the group's been broken down into 3 separate kind of work groups, I guess, to help divide the initial workload. Can you tell us about each of those groups, which one each of you are on, and what those groups are responsible for accomplishing?
I'll start. Okay, I'm on the naming and communications committee, so we're trying to come up with a name for this new entity. And of course, we don't want it to be landlocked. There are things like Arklamis, but there's this desire to see this expand beyond these Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi. And so we're still working on that. By the way, if you all have any suggestions, please email me, DemetriaJD@yahoo.com. Some of the things we've been thinking about, or maybe names around some part of the mission of the organization, or some sort of regional landmark or geographic thing. And we've kind of been looking at the Mississippi River, which touches a lot of places, including Tennessee, that maybe in the future may become a part of us. We don't know. But we've been meeting, we've been talking. We haven't gotten to a conclusion yet, but we know that it's really important, because as they do some of the legal things, the name has to be in those documents. So it's important for us to get to a final decision with that soon.
And I'm on the bylaws and organization team, and we're looking at how to merge the 3 groups into one, and the options for each state, and the bylaws, the documents that are necessary. So we're working on a draft of the bylaws. We are waiting on the naming of it, but once that's done, and we'll also deal with the nonprofit status with IRS, things like that.
And finally, the personnel committee, and I think Preston and I are both on that group, and Hal's on there as well. And so the real job is to figure out the job descriptions for these 2 co-coordinators that we've talked about. We've also talked about the need for an administrative assistant to be somewhere, whether it would be in a 3rd location apart from the 2 coordinators, or there would be some other office with an administrative assistant. But the 2 co-coordinators, there was a lot of discussion about that model to start out with before we proposed that. And there's been a lot of, not confusion, but concern about how you do delineate that. So we're really working, Preston's in the process of sort of gathering from the group the ideas about what things should go in a job description for the 2 co-coordinators, with the idea of seeking 2 separate skill sets that we go forward and look, but also 2 complementary skill sets with 2 people that are going to be carrying the load, although they're going to be focused on different functions. So that's our next task. Some of the issue with all 3 groups is sort of the timing of everything. So, do we hire before we have bylaws? Do we have to have bylaws before we hire people? What should the role of the people that are going to be hired into these jobs be in deciding some of these things? So how far can we go with one piece or the other? But that's pretty much on the personnel side where we are.
And I would just add, for me, there's one question that I keep asking myself, which is, if I was one of these co-coordinators, what would I want to have done on day one? Right? What would I want us to do before I get there? And what are the things that I would want to help shape? There are going to be some things that we're going to need coordinators to help us do and help us shape and help us figure out. So what are the things that we have to do before they arrive, and what are the things that we need them to help us do? And that, you feel like you're threading a needle in some ways with that, but I think we'll slowly figure that out as we go.
Thank you. Another question. So we know the time frame on these types of organizational processes always as soon as possible. And understanding that, what is your expectation of the time frame to complete the initial work of getting to the point where we can actually hire someone, and then to actually becoming fully functional, so having them hired on the ground and ready to start?
Y'all make the promises. I want.
I think we can give you a better answer to that question, Jay, after the CBF General Assembly, because that's going to be the first time we're going to have a chance to do at least a measure of face-to-face interaction across the groups and deal with some of this chicken and egg stuff we've been talking about here. I'd be loath to give you a definitive answer right now, but I think by the time we leave Dallas, we ought to have some pretty firm parameters in place. And y'all disagree?
I think the answer is it depends.
Yeah.
We do have aspirations, and we set goals that we wanted to have the bylaws. We wanted to have those pretty well done. We wanted to know what to call ourselves. It's hard to talk about us right now because we don't know what to call ourselves. So those are things that we want to have done, and you have to have a degree of that done before you start a search process. So our goal was at the General Assembly to have the bylaws as firm as they could be, have a name, and have job descriptions pretty much ironed out so that we can begin a search process. So maybe by the fall, that is not a promise. That is a hope and an aspiration that maybe by the fall we'll be a legal entity and have some folks hired, but we'll see.
Thank you. Other questions from the floor or online?
Can we have a conversation with y'all about naming real quick, since Demetria put that on the table? I'll tell you what some of our concerns are with the naming, and y'all can tell us what the answer should be. So we talked about Arklamis, but what if churches in Memphis want to jump into this? You've misnamed yourself. We talked about Delta, but you have places in all three states where Delta's not exactly, Fayetteville's not Delta. There are places in western Mississippi, and Shreveport is not Delta. So that's where this Mississippi River kind of as the central landmark, but the flow, the current of the river, something like that. Is that how we go about naming this? We talked about the Great River region, so that it's not just one river, but it's all the rivers that kind of tie our region together. Any thoughts that y'all have about how does that strike you? What do you like, not like? Talk back a little bit.
And the one about the flow, the specific name is CBF Gathering Waters, which kind of touches the region and the possibility of mission at the same time. It's actually my personal favorite, but I'm open. And then there was CBF, like you said, Great River, and CBF Big River. But we're still, it's still a work in progress, as you have heard. that down. It's definitely possible.
We can do whatever we want to do
Right.
at this point.
Anyone else?
The Arkansas River doesn't go through Fayetteville, but we can't call it the Razorback River.
Can't do it.
Any other thoughts?
Right. Well, I'll speak to that. Well, before you answer the South Central, we did discuss this concept of South Central, and for some people of a certain age, like it has some other negative connotations that are connected to other regions in the United States out west. So that was brought up by someone in our team that said, for some people, that may not sound so unifying, you know, because there's this South Central thing. That was just one thought. Just wanted to share. Mid-South?
That, you know, Memphis and Little Rock feel Mid-South. New Orleans, that's not exactly Mid-South. So your directional terms get funky in a hurry, and you feel like you're leaving somebody out, at least everyone I've thought of.
That's not directional terms for heartland words. That's easy.
Yeah.
Fellowship Southwest, I get it. But the directional terms for a hugely diverse region make it really hard. And this one is goofy. By the way, I do not like the first thing y'all said. I hate that first.
What was that?
Oh, yeah, that's been stricken. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yes. That one was quickly stricken because it's landlocked, too. It doesn't, yeah.
Yeah.
But what about something like, I mean, I'm just spitballing. CBF the flow. The flow.
The flow.
I don't know, you know, the flow. It doesn't give you a direction, but it gives you something. I don't think that's it, but it leaves out the geography,
Uh-huh.
which is problematic no matter how you.
That's right.
So for those online, that recommendation from the floor was CBF, the flow.
And I like that. The question then would be, does that communicate enough to people, right? Does that, but yeah, my brain is in the same place yours is on that. Yeah, I don't like it when my brain's in the same place yours is. Yeah.
Well, listen, just off the top of my head, because he's just said the flow, I've been doing my own, you know, time of devotional, and just recently a word God has been personally giving me is like beyond the river. It's about the time when in Joshua 24, when all the tribes were gathering together, and even the 2.5 tribes that were on the other side that had settled before were called beyond the river. I'm just throwing that out there. CBF, beyond the river. That's just off for this moment. Beyond the rivers. Okay.
What about CBF currents?
I like that.
From the floor, that was CBF currents, like currents of rivers. That's a great idea.
It's sort of like naming your kid. You know, you can think of the reasons why you don't like a name, but somebody's not going to like it. But it's hard to arrive at the one that, you know, it's going to be everybody's choice. And I like the idea of the movement. I think in these last few suggestions is really special.
Sue Smith said perhaps direct rivers, plural, not just Mississippi, but also Arkansas, Ouachita, et cetera. Room for other rivers. Rivers, plural.
Okay, that's good.
like that.
Are there any other thoughts from the floor?
And Mike, I don't mean to put you on the spot. I heard a rumor that the bylaws might be best worked out not if we merge the 3 separate states into one, but if we took one state's established bylaws and kind of merged the 2 other ones into one that already exists. So not creating new bylaws, but merging into one that we have. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Right, and one benefit we had with the bylaws is there are so many groups that have bylaws. We have these 3 states, plus we have Fellowship Southwest, and we had one other I forgot. But we looked at all those and just came to a consensus that the Mississippi bylaws are probably the most workable to start with, and we're just going to make that fit the region. And so it's not necessary to draft any bylaws from scratch, and we had great resources on that.
So that might expedite the process as well.
Right. Well, I think once the naming falls into place, that the bylaws will be really easy to move forward.
Okay, so one suggestion that came from Facebook was CBF or Great Rivers, plural, and then from the floor here in the room, CBF the Ark.
Without the D.
CBF Ark. Not like Arkansas, like Noah's Ark. Or the Ark with ARC, like the Ark of Justice. Any other naming suggestions?
If inspiration does strike, please let us know.
Yes, please.
What about other questions for the panel? One I would have is, what can we do for you all as a group and as individuals? How can we support you besides giving you naming options? What other ways can we support you? How can we pray for your group?
I would say definitely pray for us. Everybody, all 15 people, now 18 people who are on our governing board have other things to do. And so pray for us that we can balance all this and yet put in the work. I mean, this is heavy lifting work to create an organization. So pray for us in that regard. What Randy and Hal both said, I encourage you to show up in Dallas. I'm excited about that. CBF will likely never be closer to us than in Dallas in terms of their General Assembly. And if that's the first time that we gather together as a region, that will be a very special moment. So if at all possible, come to CBF General Assembly, and then I think you will begin to see what is happening, and that will help both answer some questions and generate some excitement in your own soul.
And I'd also say, please just still share concerns, thoughts, questions with us. Nothing is set yet. And we still are very much in the mode of trying to gather as much information and thought all of our churches. I mean, I know that throughout this process, that's been sort of the guiding principle for us, is that to make sure that the churches in CBF Arkansas feel the community and still understand, you know, how they look within this new region. So we still need to know what concerns, questions, thoughts there are from your congregations. So any of us, I think our email addresses are on the information from tonight, and we would love to still hear from people so we can bring those thoughts and those ideas and questions back to the governing board.
And my suggestion, building on Joni's comments, is that we need to maintain momentum in what we're doing in our missions and ministries so far, and not wait for, you know, something new to come. Let's keep working on what we've been doing well, and then meld that into the new structure.
I think that's a great suggestion, and we don't have to wait for the formal organization to be finalized. Right now, we have all kinds of opportunities for creative ministry across state lines that we really weren't thinking about it just a few months ago.
And also just continue to pray that our hearts would be, you know, really come together. And as part of the naming and communication, as we're coming together with this new identity, that everyone is still seeing like the Revelation 7:9 image. We're not a melting pot, but where every tribe and tongue, you know, are coming together and still being seen, but worshiping in a unified way. So if you could pray for us in that regard.
Super, thank you. Thank you. Any other questions?
I think we all sense that this merger wouldn't happen apart from Arkansas, that we're the stabilizing force in this merger. To be totally candid with you, financially, in terms of churches, in terms of leaders, this merger does not happen apart from Arkansas. But I also think that this merger can strengthen the work of Arkansas and connect pastors who aren't connected. I think about our South Arkansas pastors that are in the room tonight who are closer to churches in northern Louisiana than central Arkansas. What does this mean for them? What could this mean for them community-wise? And I'm excited about those sorts of collaborations as well. So pray for that and help us seek that. Help us find churches and individuals in these 3 states that need to be in CBF if they knew about CBF, because I think there's a lot of potential in that regard.
One of the things I've most enjoyed in our brief time of Zoom meetings over the past few months is the forward-thinking approach of the members on of the group. There's some very, very capable people that have been assembled, and it's inspiring to me just to listen to their vision, listen to their hopes and dreams for the future, and it gets me excited just to be with them.
Well, would you help me thank this group for the work that they have done and are continuing to do? So as we close tonight, I should have done this at the end of the business meeting, but was so ready to adjourn the business meeting and get the council up here, I failed to do so. Let me thank the Second Baptist Church AV team for giving up a Friday night to be here and help us tonight, for the Second Baptist Church Hospitality Group who fed us so well and took care of us before the meeting. We thank all of you for the time and the effort that you gave. We thank you for your service to us and to so many others. I'd also like to say a special thank you to Dot Henson, who's our financial secretary within CBF Arkansas. We all know, Ray and Randy especially know, that nothing gets done at CBF Arkansas if it weren't for Dot. So we want to thank you for being here tonight and thank you for all of your work. We're most grateful. And help me thank Dot. I'd also like to thank the coordinating council for their service for this year, and obviously for your service as we move forward, for your hard work and your continued dedication to CBF Arkansas. For the officers for this year, to Beverly, to Rod, to Joni, for your service with CBF Arkansas. And a special thanks to Randy Hyde, who has jumped in with both feet and done a marvelous job as our interim coordinator. We wouldn't all be together. We wouldn't be having this meeting if it weren't for you organizing us and making sure that we were all together. So thank you for doing that. No, you've done wonderfully well, and we are most appreciative. And so with all of that said, I would like to call on Brittany Stillwell, who's the Associate Pastor of Children and Families at Second Baptist, to lead us in our closing benediction.
Let's pray. Creator God, you are up to something big, and so we give you thanks. And we commit ourselves again to joining in your work, to following where you lead, and to being part of that arc and that bending, even if sometimes it feels like we're tugging with all of our might toward justice. Thank you for this council and the work that they've done. Thank you for our coordinating council and the ways they hold us together. Thank you for CBF Arkansas and the way that we are your light in the state. Show us how to be that as we leave this place. Show us how to be that in the weeks and days ahead, and prepare us for a joyous uniting with our other states as we come together to be one. We pray all of this in the name of the one who made us, our Creator God. Amen.
We're adjourned. Good night.